Okay, I'll get started here on a bit of a summary for what we've been doing in regard to particularly skepticism and nihilism, and then nihilism in relation to idealism and realism, and then the items that are unaccounted for there. So particularly not really coming full circle back to nihilism nor subjectivism, and we need to work on that, the broad sense of subjectivism that's being worked with here, that inter alia, the philosophers who are subjectivists are not only subjectivists. So that's an important point to start off with. So the Kantian, the Hegelian, the Nietzschean, the Platonic, they're not only subjectivists, they provide so much more than the subjective perspective. But because we have what we can call a Platonic subjectivity, a Kantian subjectivity, and a Nietzschean subjectivity, an Hegelian subjectivity, and further than that, a Freudian subjectivity, and a Foucauldian subjectivity or a Deleuzian subjectivity, we will be broadening that concept of philosophy in its history as a presentation of subjectivity and subjectivism, and the philosophers who do so as, amongst other things, as I say, subjectivist. So in doing that, summary from relativism, skepticism, nihilism, that work in there, we're just going to review what we were doing with the types or the approach to such a thing as skepticism, for example. So we noted passive and active skepticism. Now, you're not necessarily going to go and find a philosophy textbook and discover that there's this category, active and passive skepticism. That's not what these talks are about. This is me speaking freely about the use of concepts such as skepticism, or the practice of skepticism. As I said at the time, October 2022, skepticism was a form of negation, but when it develops, usually dialectically, when it develops its own position, it's not actually, it ceases to become remain skeptical. So a skeptical response is a negation of what's presented without a response other than that negation. So, and remaining skeptical, I mean, it really is, it's just one I don't know, disposition, if you like, that you can draw on. A skeptical disposition will be naturally negative. But as I broke it up at the time, we've got skepticism is mostly passive because of that negation. It does the work of the negation, but goes no further. So you would say that it is passive for that reason, that it displaces through negation what has been presented in an argument. So, and on that side, should someone present an argument, so let's say materialism, idealism, realism, from our last video, you've got certain claims in there that the skeptical response is often something that's presents as quite reasonable, but it doesn't necessarily replace whatever the initiating question assumed or came with or started out with. It doesn't replace it with a new question. It doesn't answer the question. As I say, it's a negation. That's what skepticism, for the most part, will be. So in a substantive sense, we say that it's passive, but I did suggest that there is an active skepticism. But that's where you start to move away from that pure negation. Now, where we're talking like this, we're talking relations, so it's not as if that can be a fixed position, that you are only in a negating position. There is some work of negation, but there's also productivity in development of argument, and that's where we're getting into an active approach. So skeptical can be a strong feature of your approach in philosophy. So science itself has to have a built-in skepticism in its structure, but that's a very developed principle with which science will work, and to anticipate a bit of the Karl Popper element of science, developed to the point where you are confident with your results because you build in certain tests or falsification that produce answers that can't be, well, firstly can't be otherwise. That's what we're after in science. We want it to be deductive, mathematic-like, so you always know 2 + 2 is 4. You want to know your science applies in the real world in much the same way, but with a whole bunch of caveats, because it's not pure deduction. It's not a pure activity. You could call maths a pure science, I suppose, because it can produce that necessary truths, if you like. So if we have an active skepticism, which is a kind of rare skepticism, maybe the skepticism of science could be classed as such because it's so developed, and we're going to just set passive skepticism aside as a kind of just a negation. So it's not an argument in development of any sort, that passive nihilism, whereas the active could be. So it's only a matter of practicing skepticism, applying your principles and your tenets to the point where you've decided you've either found an answer or hit your limits, and then maybe consider this question: can I do something different with my skepticism, or is it time to move into something else? So same again with nihilism. We said that there was a passive nihilism and an active nihilism. Now the passive nihilism is kind of an error of judgment, because it's not as if you get a pure nihilism. This problem in philosophy of abstraction, you end up with these pure things that really aren't at all viable for the practical world. So a passive nihilism may reject, and like the skepticism, displace what is presented. But that's, again, an undeveloped disposition. Skepticism develops into something. What does nihilism develop into when it is not an absolutist kind of nihilism? It's not a simply zero kind of nihilism, just a nothingness that we acknowledge in some sense. What is it about nihilism that's a bit more, something that we could speak about more than just that position? Nothing matters, nothing is of value, you can't get subject and object to come together, they don't hold a relationship, therefore your values are merely human, nothing strictly more than that human need as developing values to then practice what you do, practice in the world. So that kind of nihilism is a passive nihilism because it's still handling values somehow, or if it's not handling values, it is engaging in intuition, in use of reason, and we want to say, because we're doing the relationship between these elements, we want to say, well, what strictly is happening there in that behaviour? Can you have a behaviour around nihilism? Now, the 19th century nihilists may well have been quite active and destructive. I don't know, I don't read Dostoevsky, but the actions of nihilists is not really what I mean here when I say nihilism, the active form of nihilism. Active form of nihilism would be more about engaging that problem of values. So being true to nihilism would be a denial of values, a displacement of values, just as the skeptic may displace a certain story or claim with that negation that it practices. But what's going on with nihilism, it's a bit different. If it's active, it's engaging in an attempt at objectivity, acknowledging the difficulty of objectivity because the value of objectivity is not established. So even though it's an attempt at being objective, it can't do it. It recognises objectivity or the value of objectivity. It knows that that value has no value, if you like, or at best it's a human need and therefore subjective. It would seem it goes nowhere, but that in itself is something. That practice of an active nihilism is in itself a practice of philosophy, if you like, that recognises an issue, so it's critical of a situation, and then perhaps, like the skeptic, remains negative, and that will be more on the passive side, or then attempts to be a bit more active, and then, rather than being a parallel to skepticism, is actually actively spouting nihilism, if you like. I mean, even that in itself, to continually say there is no value, I'll make a cup of tea. To do that, it's not as if you get to jump off the whatever carries us in life. You don't avoid leading a life or being led in life. You can end up in a malaise, as we know, and achieve zero. But that's not necessarily nihilism. So the nihilist would really, in a certain sense, base their behaviour on the fact that there's no values. That could still be a passive kind of approach. But I think the active nihilism is more interesting because nihilism develops from that. And we might, at some point, I mean, it's laboured, but it's there that we account for the behaviour of some in this, not so much grappling of nihilism and value, but more so that the behaviour indicates a nihilism that is active. So that's a fair bit of work. Anyway, that's passive-active. Let's move to reactive and active. So reactive, in terms of, well, one, behaviour, but two, claims, so perhaps philosophical claims, but perhaps other kinds of claims, or a disposition towards certain forms of morality over others. That might be more reactive, and we've got a whole range of literature from particularly Nietzsche to Freud and beyond into the European intellectual legacy that gives us what we can say is a subjectivity around these elements of living, these dispositions, if you like, where you can break up morality. You can say what kind of morality. So insofar as we live a moral life, we can then draw in that basic composition of the human that Freud gives us, whereby a superego or an approving voice or a ruling element in the subject is the executive function that's driving, perhaps not motivating, but is driving behaviour. So that's a sort of getting towards a Freudian model of subjectivity, or a Freudian subjectivity. So of those, elements in the subject, do we have in that subject, do we have reactive elements, and do we have, or can we have, what's called active elements? So that is, active would be genuinely autonomous action, so action that's not necessarily driven by principles, high-minded principles. This is why it's connected to nihilism, because nihilism may not necessarily act from principles, because principles, again, subjective, like values, they're kind of like this exercise of values, or a principle will be based on a value. And this is why Nietzsche is important, because there's a connection with nihilism and this concept of the active. Nietzschean subjectivity will really want to point out the reactive type is the weaker type. Now, reactive type is also the herd type, so there's strength in the herd, and then you've got reason for that weakness being identified as strength. So, but that's another story. That's about what he's doing in the genealogy of morality. What we're trying to do here, though, is just sort of build up this idea, and going back to the previous tape, the previous talk, build up this idea of not so much layers, but a structure in the subject, such that we can speak of fractured subjectivity. Now, I use that in lots of ways. It can refer to metaphysics. So fractured subjectivity can be effectively a metaphysics, where you've said mind, body. That will be an example of fractured subjectivity. That's why we don't have to get too concerned about terms like metaphysics, which I think in the last talk I gave the definition that it's really only an application of a concept to circumstances or environment or reality or conditions, or that concepts belonged somehow outside with an objective view upon a subjective reality. The idea that we can actually do that. I mean, that's just one little version of it. The point here is that fractured subjectivity could actually mean elements within human nature that a lot of this is relevant only for an individual. So it's only for an individual to consider, am I strong in the right way, or am I actually in a kind of denial? Anyway, I digress. So that's reactive active, or if you like, superego and ego. Let's just put ego down here. That doesn't equal ego. I'm just sort of superego, and again, principles, the parent in the human as opposed to the child, or the even more base elements. So what we're trying to say is, what's the relationship between nihilism and the active elements of the subject? Why is Nietzschean subjectivity so important? How does fractured subjectivity? Is Nietzschean subjectivity an example of fractured subjectivity? Yes. But I think you would find that the active type that Nietzsche speaks of would have more cohesion. And this is perhaps a question for the sociologist that works on the sociological aspects of the individual, if you like, such that you can speak of cohesion. And I think the early anthropologist Durkheim did a lot of work on that, sociological elements of the individual. So certain groups, certain individuals had more or less cohesion. Now, how much can you account for that in a culture? You have to at some point say, where is the individual in all this culture? And I think you find fractured subjectivity is quite a good concept for that, because one, you're talking about specifics within a person and you're acknowledging the subjective in the person, which is not to say the total is subjective. How can you be objective about subjective? Well, you don't really, there's no being subjective about subjectivity. I think if you go down that track of trying to work on subjectivity, admittedly it's problematic to be objective about it. However, you can make claims about it. I don't think that that's surprising. Certainly sociological approaches would be classed subjective on perhaps a total view of reality. So would the hard science consider the soft science more subjective? I think that's probably a reasonable position to hold. Nothing unusual. Anyway, to be continued.